Welcome back to Reclining at Table with Jesus. We're looking at Luke chapter 6 and verse 12. We are looking at the prayer life of Jesus. We've already done one episode in chapter 6 verse 12, and we saw in these days Jesus went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. So we saw the period where he was praying. It says in verse 12, in these days. So if you want to know more about that, look next, go back to the episode that was done last week. But today, I want us to look at the place of prayer. It says in verse 12 that he went out to a mountain to pray. So the place he went to was a mountain. And I just want to encourage you as we start that Jesus is praying here at night. And like the shepherds back in chapter 2 verse 8, where they were keeping watch over their flocks by night, Jesus is the great shepherd and the chief shepherd and the good shepherd of our souls, that even when the disciples are sleeping, he watches over us even at the night times and prays for us, because saints often go through a night time of the soul. Not just physically do we sleep, but spiritually there are times where we go through darkness and difficulties, and he leads us through the valley of the shadow of death. And I want to encourage you that Jesus prays for us when we are in the night seasons of our soul. He won't sleep nor slumber. So if you're going through a difficult time now, be encouraged that Jesus is praying for you. But let's have a look in verse 12 at the place. So Jesus at night goes out to a place of prayer, and he goes to the mountain. And let me just say three things quickly about this mountain. Why would he go to the mountain? So firstly, to have perspective. When you go up a mountain, it gives you height, and when you look down, you start to realize how small houses are, cars are, churches are, schools are. So often when I go up to a high place and I look down, I start to see the things that I used to think were big start to seem actually smaller than I realized. In my mind, they're big. When I start to get God's perspective, it starts to show me actually how small these things are. Initially big, but when I go up high and look down, it starts to make God look big and the problems smaller. So I'm wondering if Jesus goes up the mountain just to get perspective, because a lot of God's people go up the mountain, whether it's Moses and Elijah, and they come back different people normally because they get perspective. Have you ever noticed that Paul would say in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 17 that all the suffering he goes through, he calls them light and momentary. Okay, I'm going, they're not light and they're not momentary. They lasted a long time. But because he's got right perspective of God and eternity, that he knows that he will look back at his suffering and he will say they are light and momentary. But unless you're up high, unless the Lord leads us to the rock higher than us, and as we stand on that rock and we look back, actually they look smaller than initially you thought. Paul would say in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 7, the thorn in the flesh. And this thorn was causing him great pain. But he compared to Jesus' cross, this bit of wood wasn't a cross. It was a thorn. It's only small in perspective. So sometimes going up high, getting out in terms of creation, allows us to get perspective of our problems and the periods we find ourselves in. Helps us look back, look down, and look forward. It gives us perspective. Secondly, it gives us privacy. So Jesus often says to his disciples, go into your closet, okay, and spend time with your Father alone. But Daniel did the same. Daniel would go to his house in Daniel 6 verse 10 and spend 3 different times praying in privacy. But actually the mountain again was a place of privacy. Jesus could go and get away, and he's not going to meet anybody really on the mountain unless it was the people he took with him. It's a place of privacy where we can spend time with God. But Charles Spurgeon was really helpful here, because he quotes Jesus in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 7 and says that during Jesus' lifetime he offered up prayers with loud cries and tears. And Charles Spurgeon says, when did Jesus pray loudly? When did Jesus cry loudly in prayer? And we know he did in the Garden of Gethsemane. but it was probably also when he went up on the mountain, he had an opportunity to vocalize and let loose his emotions and his feelings, something he probably couldn't do in the synagogue or in the temple or actually in the house at night, because I'm sure there would have been a few shouts from the rooms next door, be quiet. So it gives us privacy, time to get away, and just to let our hearts and our mouths be free before the Lord. And finally, in Luke 6 verse 12, why the mountain? It also allows us, as we're in creation, to see the parables. Jesus often would say that nature is a parable, nature is a story that's communicating to us, because the heavens in Psalm 19 verse 1 are always speaking, the heavens are declaring the glory of God. And Jesus will often say, look at the birds of the air, look at the lilies of the field, look at the ants. Jesus would also use creation to tell us a biblical truth, because creation is a picture and a parable. So as we are out, and actually I remember praying on a hill down in Gowerton. There's this big hill and I call it Steve's Hill. I just love going up there with Beck and with Amelia, just taking a coffee and praying. And often I just see the birds gliding in the air effortlessly. And the Lord just says, look at the birds of the air. Steve, why are you anxious? Look at them. I care for them. They don't sow. They don't reap. Okay, Steve, you're much more valuable than they. And it's normally when I'm out and I look at the birds and creation, does it do so good to my soul? So I just want to encourage you in your prayer life as we model Jesus, not just in the period of his prayer, but in the place of his prayer. Find a private place for yourself, whether it's inside the house or somewhere safely outside the house. It could be in the fields, down by the beach, down by the reservoir, up on a mountain, somewhere that will give you perspective, it'll give you privacy, and it will help you to look at creation and see the parables that God may want to communicate to us through creation. So I pray that you would enjoy time with the Lord this week in prayer. May the Lord bless you today.